Hello. Professor Rothman, thank you for the invitation to be part of the panel at the International Sign Conference, Interpreting and Translation. I will present on the state of the art in research to date. Conference interpreting is linked to the discipline of interpreting studies as a research field. The field of interpreting studies has grown significantly and undergone paradigm shifts. Initially, research focused on theories from conference interpreters' experiences, i.e., their personal reflections and considerations from their work at conferences. Following this, there was a shift toward empirical research, where data was collected and analyzed. This quantitative approach was completed through experimental research, such as surveys or cognition studies linked to the interpreting process. These methods were based on cognitive and psycholinguistic sciences. Then we moved to a sociolinguistic approach, which was a qualitative research method that investigated the context of interpreting, looking at the interpreter as part of a social exchange. Following this, we saw a transition to a sociological research approach. This method analyzed the thoughts and ideologies of interlocutors as they pertain to interpreting. So we notice a shift from the scientific approach of researching interpreting towards a liberal arts and humanities approach. This trend is seen in spoken language research, and we're seeing a similar trend occurring in sign language interpreting studies. Again, it started with personal theorizing on experiences, followed by empirical research and analysis, presenting facts based on evidence. So, I will now delve into sign language interpreting studies, highlighting some of the main approaches to the majority of its research. As an example, research conducted in which the interpreter is filmed working on assignment. The data is then examined and analyzed. As the data is naturally occurring, it can then be investigated following the discourse analytic approach. Next, we see an ethnographic approach wherein an interpreter is observed working. Alternatively, group or individual interviews may be conducted. Survey research is another method we see in the field. We also see experimental approaches where investigation of interpreters' cognitive processing is conducted by comparing various datasets. Then there is action research that mostly takes place in teaching. The aim is to assess the impact of changes made by various teaching methods. We are now seeing an increased use of the mixed methods approach. This approach allows researchers to choose a variety of methods and combine them for their research. This method is growing in popularity in the field of sign language interpreting studies. This slide illustrates the work of Leeson, Worm, and Van Meegeren. They state the need for 3 types of sign language interpreting research. Firstly, research that feeds directly into interpreter training by describing interpreting skills and strategies that interpreters need to develop. Secondly, we need research that produces technical tools for interpreters, as well as interpreting students, to complement their learning. And finally, we need research that expands our understanding of interpreting practices, the role of interpreter, and the interpreting context. In short, any research that gives us a broader understanding of interpreting is needed. This is illustrated by 3 types of SLI research needed. So, what research has been conducted to date on international sign interpreting at a conference level? Here, we focus on international sign in conference settings. Overall, research on interpreting IS in these settings is minimal. There is very little done to date. That said, research on international sign interpreting in any setting is sparse. The same shifts in research paradigms as seen in spoken language and sign language research is also found in international sign research. Again, we see that studies began with personal theorizing based on interpreters' experiences. What we've seen more recently is the shift towards empirical research, so data is starting to be collected and analyzed for findings. Then we may see a shift again. For now, I'll show you some examples. From the personal theorizing era, I present quotes from two famous IS interpreters. The first quote is from Liz Scott Gibson, and the second from Bill Moody. Both interpreters have documented their extensive IS interpreting experiences with reference to the skills, knowledge, and experience required for IS interpreting at conference settings. Both give in-depth testimonials of their experiences, but no empirical research was collected. What we see now is the emergence of critical personal reflection in interpreting research. Really, a personal reflection examines one's work by looking at one's experiences and feelings. However, for a critical personal reflection, you unpack it further. One example of this is a blog, as you can see on this slide. This blog is co-authored by Andy Carmichael, a practicing hearing IS interpreter, and deaf academic Dr. Marta de Mulder. Both wrote about their experience on working together. Marta wrote from her experience of presenting an IS at the WFD conference, and Andy as the working interpreter from International Sign to English. They documented their experiences in both writing and sign. They illustrated how they worked together and critically analyzed their cooperation. Although this was not empirical research, there is some data in the form of a transcript of the spoken English that the authors examine and refer to. This blog's discussion is quite important. Now, we see the field of IS studies has transitioned to empirical research, following the trends in research conducted in interpreting studies, initially in spoken language work and then signed. At first, most of the data was compared to analyze cognitive processes within interpreting. This then moved towards a more sociolinguistic approach, observing and examining what is actually happening. Then, we see sociological research conducted by interviews. Here are examples of such. To date, I think there have only been maybe 11 studies published. There may be, in fact, more, but as it stands, we don't know. Coming back to the examples, these studies explore various avenues, such as cognitive processes used or expository interpreting from English to International Sign. Other research examined work from IS and English. Some studies collected data through interviews, examining interpreting preparation strategies and working as a team. Surveys conducted unpacked the demographic profile of IS interpreters. There was work completed investigating deaf interpreters working between IS and written text or other signed languages. There was also research conducted on informal interpreting, where sign language users clarify the information interpreted by hearing interpreters amongst each other, aka informal interpreting. These studies mentioned are not specifically in conference settings, but are conducted in formal settings, such as postgraduate educational settings, conferences, or project meetings. However, all these settings are similar to conference-level interpreting. Yet, it's not enough. The work we have provides little information, research, or evidence of IS interpreting at the conference level. We simply need more research. Coming back to the types of interpreting research that are needed, let's explore what we've gained. Firstly, we just saw there is research that describes the skills and strategies needed for IS work that interpreters must develop, such as understanding IS that is used by deaf sign language users. We can see that the research is beginning, but more work must be done in order to understand the process of interpreting IS at the conference level. Right now, we know relatively little. Secondly, we simply do not have the technical tools that can support interpreters in their work, be they deaf or hearing interpreters or interpreting students. We have not seen any research providing evidence for this to date. On the third point, we do have some research that expands our understanding of interpreter practices in settings using international sign. We can give this point a small tick because we can see a few research studies are in progress. However, from the larger pool of research conducted on sign language interpreting, work on IS conference settings is relatively minute. Looking ahead, what more is there to do in relation to IS conference interpreting research? On the slide are some of my thoughts. Fundamentally, more research is needed on conference interpreting. This can include other formal settings such as high-level meetings, project meetings, or political events. We have studies exploring IS interpreting at the conference level, yet most of these are deaf-centric events, such as events for teaching the deaf or conferences of the deaf. However, there is no research collected on interpreting at the EU or the UN. This is an area where we need the data. My previous research with Dr. Rachel McKee examined interpreting strategies, but was published in 2002. We are now seeing that IS is evolving at speed, and how people present in IS has changed. Do our interpreting strategies need to change accordingly? We need more research on this matter. Next, there has been some work on team interpreting. Maya DeWitt has started research on team interpreting in IS settings. But of course, we need more. How do we work at UN events that are live streamed or on TV? How does one interpret from captions into sign language? How do interpreters prepare? What exactly are the required skills to work as an IS interpreter, be they hearing or deaf? What assessment tools can be used in testing? How do we certify IS interpreters? What about power structures and intersectionality? How do we consider gender parity, ethnic diversity, and more? What about the power imbalances between deaf and hearing interpreters? We need extensive research on these issues. With research, we can better manage the expectations of organizers who request the services of IS interpreters. We can explore how to bridge that gap. It is possible to conduct research using a quantitative approach with a qualitative approach. This would be considered a mixed method study. Not only is there a need to study IS interpreting, but a need to study sign language interpreting at conference or high-level settings generally. As we've seen, there is little work so far. There is much more research yet to be done in both sign language and IS conference interpreting. I hope to see the field grow in the next few years.
Hello, my name's Kathy Pearson and I work for SCIC, or DG Interpretation, which is the interpreting service of the European Commission. In my unit, the Multilingualism and Knowledge Development Unit, we're responsible for relations with universities and for succession planning, ensuring we have enough new interpreters coming through. Until now, that's mostly been for spoken languages because it's our remit to cover the 24 official EU languages. But we're now also branching out into helping train sign language interpreters, because we do also cover sign languages in our meetings. So national sign languages very occasionally, but more often than not, international sign. Next slide. There's been an increase in demand for requests for international sign interpretation recently, as you can see on this slide, particularly in 2020. Next slide. This, to some extent, is because of the Commission press conference every week, which is now being interpreted into international sign. Now, SCIC is very keen to boost the provision of sign language interpreting. We want to be able to respond to the requests, and all of the different actions that you see here on the slide are about expanding the pool of international sign interpreters on our books. And I'm going to tell you about those now. Next slide. Only briefly about the mentoring scheme, because that's what Maya's going to be talking about, but we had 4 sign language interpreters come to us for a period of 4 weeks, which got extended because of COVID. They were in SCIC and we paid for them to come, we paid for the training. And then some of it was done online, as you'll hear about in due course. So the mentoring scheme, which we hope to be able to reproduce and to do a second time, if not this year, then next year. Another thing we're doing is putting international sign speeches in the speech repository. The speech repository is a database of speeches, and we now have over 50 speeches in international sign, and national sign languages are coming soon. But again, the majority of speeches in there are spoken language speeches in all of the EU languages, as well as others as well, Arabic and Chinese. We also have a grants program where we give funding to universities. Any university with whom we cooperate can apply for a grant. At the moment, it's Heriot-Watt that has the grant. They're organising an international sign booster this summer and developing a curriculum, because we need good graduates coming out of the programs interpreting sign language conference interpreters. We also have the Knowledge Centre on Interpretation, where you can find lots of information about interpreting in general, but there's also dedicated pages on sign language interpreting, both for conferences and for public service interpreting. So our aim and what we want to see happening in the future is that we want to encourage synergies between conference interpreting courses for spoken languages and those for signed languages. But we want those synergies and that togetherness to be taken into the workplace as well. So we want to create a real sense of belonging for our international sign interpreters. They need to have good contact with the head of booth, and we need to make sure that we have proper quality control in place, like we do for spoken languages. So SCIC is doing all of these different things because it wants to be able to meet the demand. It wants to help increase demand, but it also needs to be able to meet that demand. So we need more people, but we also need really good people. We need the quality. Quality has always been the watchword of SCIC, and that needs to be true for sign language interpretation as much as it is for spoken language interpretation. As I said, we're branching out into helping train sign language interpreters with our mentoring scheme, with our grants program, with the speech repository, to help with curriculum design, to increase professionalization, but above all, to raise awareness and to safeguard accessibility, because the Commission has a strategy in place to help for accessibility, and SCIC is contributing to that with its programs for sign language interpretation. I'm happy to answer any questions after all the speeches have been done, but for now I'll hand over to Maya.
Hello everyone. Thank you, Kathy, for your presentation. So now it's over to me. Let me first introduce myself. I am Maya de Wit. I am the coordinator of the AIC Sign Language Network, IEC stands for the International Association of Conference Interpreters. I'm also a PhD candidate at the Radboud University in the Netherlands. And I must add that I have quite extensive experience as a sign language interpreter. So now I would like to talk to you a little bit about, the EU institutions and how we as sign language interpreters can provide the service. As Kathy already explained to you, this is not something that is easily done. It's quite a complex process. So if you look at how sign language interpreters, for example, are trained in Europe, we can see historically that the level of training has actually gotten higher. So we see on average that interpreters are trained at a bachelor level. But if you look then at spoken language interpreters, they all have a conference interpreting degree. They are trained at master level as a conference interpreter. So when we go as a sign language interpreter to an EU institution to work, we really have to think about what this entails. We need to think about how we work together with spoken language interpreters, which EU institution we work for. There is a lot of knowledge that we have to gain before we actually do this job. So we can't really assume of ourselves that we can, jump from a bachelor level to a master conference level to acquire that knowledge in no time. So to actually fill up that gap, the European Commission came up with the plan to establish a mentoring scheme. And in this mentoring scheme, they thought about, recruiting sign language interpreters who themselves had already experience interpreting in their national sign language, so between their spoken language and their national sign language, and also to ask the European Union of the Deaf and the European Union of the Deaf Youth what their wishes were for, interpreters working at the EU institutions. So with all this content, a mentoring scheme was drawn up and 4 mentees were mentored during the course of a year. And they learned on how each EU institution worked, what the process was within the institutions, the aim of the institutions, the whole structure, how they were interrelated, but also the jargon. There's quite a lot of jargon that is used at the EU institutions, and it's not something that you just learn overnight. You need to take the time to really gain that knowledge. And before we actually work at the EU institutions, we have to think about all of these aspects. For example, we must know all the technical specifications. If we go into a conference room, where do we actually stand? What does our backdrop look like? We need to be able to explain to the technical team, the operators on site, which input we need, what type of receiver we need to receive actually the spoken language interpretation from the interpreters working in the booth. We need to be able to also work into a spoken language, so the interpreters in the booth actually can take relay from us. So it's a process that we need to learn, and that we can't just learn very fast. We really need to take the time to acquire that knowledge, that skill, to deliver that quality service. Another important aspect is how you actually work as a team in a conference setting. How do you position yourself? How do you support each other? You must also be aware of the important players in the setting, what their political affiliation is, what the concepts are that they're using, all the references that there are. So you have to acquire this knowledge. In addition, the EU institutions like the Commission, the Parliament, have a way and process in place to recruit interpreters. We might think, a job is offered and we go accept it, but there are very strict rules in place at the Parliament and at the Commission on how you're actually recruited as an interpreter, And so you need to know how to go through that process to actually accept an assignment when this is offered. So before you ever go and work at an EU institution, check out with deaf people who actually work in those settings, who are, maybe involved in the political arena or another aspect of the EU work, and ask them what they're looking for, what their experience is, but also what and how the EU institutions work. And talk to sign language interpreters who do have that experience in place and working at the EU institution. And, if you would ever be approached as an interpreter to work at the EU institution, consider all the aspects. What languages are requested? Which EU setting will you be working in? And then you will be able to actually deliver the service. And keep in mind that we're representing different communities. We represent the signing community, we present our profession, but we also deliver the service for the EU institutions. Thank you again for your attention. If you have any questions, let me know or send me an email. Thank you. Bye-bye.
This presentation is a collaborative work on international sign interpreting and translation at conferences in Brazil. Pinheiro, in 2020, conducted research on the relationships between policy language, sign language, and interpreting and translation for the deaf. Policy language refers to how social, civil, and linguistic aspects are connected and brought together. Our view is that international sign is a language that has a relationship to policy language. We are seeing more and more communication in IS throughout Brazil in associations, sports, social contexts, as well as tourism. With it being used in so many different types of situations, it's becoming much more common. Some time ago, it was established as a professional IS interpreting and translation service for international conferences. Now we see the need to define what professional IS interpreting and translation consists of. There are several types of interpreting that take place in conference settings. One type is platform interpreting, where there is an interpreter on stage with the presenter facing the audience. Off the platform, another interpreter is facing them, who is providing feedback and supporting the working interpreter. Smaller workshops, meetings, and trainings also require sign language interpretation and translation. Let me explain what I mean by translation. Written text is translated into sign language and captured on video for dissemination. This could be on social media, websites, and other outlets which are connected to the conference or event. In addition, people are unfamiliar with IS may ask for translations of their talk. They send us a text in Libras and request that it is translated into IS. We provide the translation and they then send it on to the conference committee. Once it is approved, they attend the conference and make their presentation. That gives you a general picture of what IS conference interpreting and translation entails. There is a record of IS interpreters at conferences starting in 2006. The first conference was for deaf youth from southern Brazil. People came from all over, and interpretation was offered in IS. The year 2010 had a massive impact on how the profession is recognized. Brazil hosted the Deaf Academics Conference, which brought people from all over the globe. At this event, a team of deaf interpreters worked between IS and Libras. This was an important moment for us in terms of the respect of this type of work. From 2006 until 2019, there were 36 conferences with IS interpretation in Brazil. The 36 conferences have covered a wide range of topics, such as academic research, human rights, culture and art, associations, youth events, climate change, and many more. Interpreting services are usually coordinated by hearing individuals. Only one conference used a deaf person to coordinate the interpreting services. Dr. Rothman has shared the importance of deaf and hearing professionals working together to coordinate conference interpreting work. So far, we have looked at professional conference interpreters and translators working in IS. There are so many other settings where professional IS interpreters and translators work. For example, situations involving the police, perhaps maybe for a visa application, or in legal settings, medical appointments, art and theatre, sports, and so on. IS interpreters and translators work in all of these contexts. Brazil has passed a sign language law. This means university students are able to get a degree in interpretation and translation between Libras and Portuguese. Currently, International Sign is not on the curriculum. And yet, due to the conferences I mentioned, we have experienced IS interpreters and translators. The deaf community and interpreting agencies acknowledge the experience of the IS practitioners, even though they do not have an interpreting and translation degree. We believe that it is crucial that the Libris law includes International Sign, as well as other minority languages used by Indigenous people and all other national sign languages. I'll also explain how Brazilian tactile sign language fits in here. The professional associations for sign language interpreters and translators working with deafblind individuals in Brazil also need to recognize the work of their colleagues working in IS. In today's world, things change very rapidly due to technology and the speed of communication, and this has had direct impact on International Sign. Here in Brazil, we have seen a steady increase of professional International Sign interpreters and translators. It used to be that some interpreters and translators volunteered to work at conferences and some were paid. But at that time, there were not many professionals working with IS. Over time, that has changed, and now they are being paid on par with other interpreters. We want to see the policies and policy language come together to show support for the development and advancement of the professional IS interpreters and translators. The three of us hope to see International Sign added to the curriculum of our professional interpreter and translator training degrees here in Brazil. This concludes the presentation. Please feel free to ask us any questions. We are grateful for your attention today. Thank you for watching. Hello, dear colleagues. My co-presenter, Sandra Sugerl, and I, Chris Peters, will be presenting on International Sign Conference Interpreting and Translation. In particular, we will focus on the emergence and professionalization in Austria and Germany. So how does one become certified as an interpreter in Germany and Austria? Of course, there are certain skill sets, expertise, and criteria that interpreters must meet in order to receive their official qualification in International Sign Interpreter. Our journey to become an interpreter begins at the University of Hamburg, which has a program dedicated to sign language interpreting with a specific strand for deaf interpreters. These programs are founded on the relevant criteria needed to become an interpreter. In total, it is a 2-year program, after which the next step is to take the certification exam in Darmstadt in Hessen. At Darmstadt, they conduct interpreting certification between a multitude of languages, such as between written German, various signed languages, and International Sign. On the basis of the results of my exam, I was awarded my certification for International Sign Interpreting from Darmstadt. In fact, both Sandra and I are certified International Sign Interpreters recognized by the German federal government. On receipt of our certification, we wanted to attain full membership to our respective interpreting associations, in Germany, the BGSD, and in Austria, UGSDV. These associations have certain benchmarks that must be adhered to in order to become a member, such as the examination and certification from Darmstadt. Both BGSD and UGSDV are members of European Interpreting Association, EFSA. As mentioned, Sandra and I are members of our national associations. The University of Salzburg, Austria, is more recently established, and I have frequently been a guest lecturer on issues pertaining to deaf interpreters. Sandra, too, has regularly lectured on similar subject matter. I'll now hand over to Sandra, who will outline the work settings for deaf interpreters. Deaf interpreters and translators can work in an array of different settings. I'll draw your attention to the top 2 bullet points on the slide. These 2 are predominantly face-to-face interaction and interpretation. Community interpreting covers a range of settings wherein interpreters are working with International Sign. In terms of conference interpreting, deaf interpreters can work from captioning into International Sign, or alternatively, they can team with a hearing interpreter to facilitate the interpretation into International Sign. The third point on the slide refers to interpreting and translation in media settings. For this domain of work, much equipment is needed, such as camera, proper lighting, backdrop, captioning systems, and so on. It is important, at this point, to make the distinction between interpreting and translating. For interpreting, materials are sent and expected back to the client in a short space of time. You must upload the text to the captioning system to then work into sign language in one take before sending it to the client. When it comes to interpreting, time is short. You have to prep and complete the task quickly. In terms of translation, you have plenty of time. You receive materials with a generous deadline. This allows the translator to study and mark up the text for the best possible translation into sign language. There is plenty of time to experiment, analyze, quality check, ensuring you're satisfied before sending it back to the client. That's the distinction between translation versus interpreting. The final 4 bullet points in the slide refer to remote work interpreting at a distance from home. There are instances in community settings when interpreting can take place via video communication with International Sign. As I mentioned, whilst talking about media interpreting and translating, you can be given materials to pre-record in a short space of time, which the client then uses at their conference. There are settings wherein the interpreter works from captioning into sign, or alternatively, they work as part of a team from whom they get the source text to interpret into International Sign Live. This list is not exhaustive by any means. Interpreters work in a range of settings, from grassroots to the international stage, such as the United Nations, European institutions, and many international level organizations. We can work in a matter of settings. From the photos, you can see the numerous settings both Sandra and I have interpreted in. We have worked at the international, European, and national level. You can see on the top right, Sandra working at the United Nations. To the top left and bottom left are photos of me working at the European level. This photo to my left is an international level conference on linguistics. To my left is an example of my work at a Pride event on a national level. Below that, Sandra is working at the Eurovision Song Contest at a European level. As you can see from these photos, we interpret at a range of events, both in person and online. Any image with an interpreter in a box are examples of us working online at various events. At these events, we can work from speech to text, which is then recorded for later use, as you can see from the image on my left. Equally, as is the case in this example, we can work from feed interpreters. The interpreters sign DGS or UGS in Sandra's case, from which we interpret into IS. In the case of the linguistics conference, I worked directly from the presenter who signed in American Sign Language into International Sign. As you can see from the examples, there are a myriad of ways we can operate, which makes it all the more fascinating. Here you see examples of IS translation work. Chris and I have carefully selected these images to give you a sense of our work. If I can bring your attention to Chris's work, in this case, he translated text which he received in advance for a conference on education. In these two photos, on the left, are from EU projects Chris translated for. Above me here, you see a sample of a translation task for which I completed for the European Commission. The photo to the right of that is when I worked for the Zero Project Conference, which took place in Vienna. Below that is a picture of my work with the Austrian broadcasters. They have a children's TV program that I translate with a team for maximum quality output for a national audience. It is important to highlight the necessary elements to ensure that we can work to the best of our capacity, such as high quality live captioning, quality assurance checks with language experts to maximize translation output. With these elements, we can work efficiently towards the best possible translation. I'll now hand it back to Chris. We hope that you've now got a better understanding of how and where we operate as professionals from the examples we have provided. As mentioned previously, there are essential aspects that must be taught that both Sandra and I have learned in order to provide quality work. We've selected one example which enshrines the idea of quality work as it pertains to translation. The DIN from which ISO 17100 was developed in 2016. There have been previous iterations of the same standard which essentially have the same content. The standard stresses the importance of high-quality professional training for those who wish to become a translator. The training should instruct how to work with a text considering norms and conventions. The standard highlights the 4 eyes principle for quality assurance. A single pair of eyes cannot ensure quality, as we can often miss our own errors or slips. This is why a colleague, a fluent user of the output language, is important as a second pair of eyes. They catch the errors for the original translator to then repair. This maximizes comprehension to the widest possible audiences. Teamwork is an important component of our work. Quality of work is also monitored and maintained via documentation, i.e., the markup of a text, or noting common mistakes made in a translation. In documenting these aspects, the translator can make a comparison across different tasks, find weaknesses in their work, and upskill on those weaker aspects. Equally, if a translator is assigned a task that is similar to one completed in the past, they can check their notes that will inform their translation. This creates a consistency across their work and minimizes any variables. These are enshrined in the DIN that are taught and adhered to. Equally, there are other requirements as prescribed by translators that interpreters must engage with. There are challenges that we face, however, we must consider the future of our profession. Please take a look at the slide. There are 3 personal challenges we would like to highlight. Firstly, when working as part of a team, we work from feed interpreters into international sign. Unfortunately, there are very few interpreters who are experienced feeders. I'll demonstrate with an example. If I'm working with CART, the captioning system, I am working from the captioner's expertise. If the captioner does not understand a word or the context, sentences will be shorter, or typos and inconsistencies will appear in their text. It could be they're dropping information, meaning I have little original text to work from. As you can imagine, it poses a great challenge. So, coming back to taking feed from a hearing interpreter, they need to know how to pack the information for deaf interpreters to work from. If they are too visual in their communication, it makes it difficult to work from. Equally, if they're too close to the written or spoken text, it can be quite challenging. There are very few who know how to strike the right balance. Finding a feeder who has the appropriate skill set and matches the need of a deaf interpreter, it can be incredibly difficult. You have to search long and hard to find the right colleague. Similarly, if a deaf translator is working on a text from English, let's say, into international sign, they need a quality check from a colleague ensuring that the translation is up to par. However, it is quite challenging to find a person who has the skill set to do this. As you'll see next on the slide, there are general challenges that we face. We, as deaf professionals, know our skill set. We provide high-quality translations. However, many clients do not understand the skill set deaf interpreters bring and employ a hearing interpreter for the task. They believe that a hearing team is sufficient and don't see the need for the deaf interpreter. This poses a great challenge to us. Additionally, there is little information on how to cooperate with deaf interpreters. Therefore, there is little to no engagement or collaboration with us as professionals. The third point illustrated in the slide pertains to teamwork, be that with hearing interpreters, with the CART system, or deaf interpreting teams. There must be training in place to ensure smooth cooperation between professionals. As interpreters or translators, we come from different education backgrounds, and deaf interpreters working with IS have a different educational background or none at all. We must align our various philosophies and training to future-proof the profession. Without training, I would be concerned for the future of the profession. Finally, I want to highlight the technical setup required by us for conferences as we work as deaf professionals. We have certain technical requirements to meet to work efficiently. However, the client must have more knowledge of our technical requirements to ensure that an event will run well. Unfortunately, this is rarely the case.
Hello everyone, and thank you for this invitation for Sophia and I to participate in this international panel. The contribution I will share stems from my experience attending international events and working with interpreters in those spaces. Participation at these events can vary in form and function. For instance, attendance at a conference seminar can mean one is receiving information through interpreting services. I regard this as passive participation. Then there is active participation, where the exchange is highly interactive and dialogic, where questions and interventions are freely expressed, working through interpreters. At meals, breaks, or in between networking sessions during conferences, they're an ideal time to lobby key people with interpreters. At international meetings of various sizes, there can be a team of interpreters working, in addition to various third parties who primarily are not sign language users. My presentation today will address the topic of working with interpreters while actively participating at international meetings, including lobbying and advocacy. I will pay particular attention to language ability, interpreting techniques, and being familiar with content matter. These are fundamental skills of interpreters working in this space. I would like to spend this time concentrating on the higher level skills and the topic of cooperation strategies. Primarily, ideal cooperation strategies depend on teamwork. I will expand on what I mean by that. The first element of successful collaboration consists of mutual understanding and clarity. Such understanding develops over time through repeated engagement. From this, a foundation of trust can be established. A lack of trust, on the other hand, often leads to poor outcomes and mismanagement of interpreted interaction. Only through repeated engagement can one develop a working relationship and trust. Identifying and engaging the most appropriate interpreters for each setting is critical and may mean different interpreting teams depending on the objective of a meeting for optimal results. Secondly, with an interpreter, I highly value being able to give and receive signals. It is essential to be informed of the true intent of a message via these signals. Doing so can help to distinguish the possible hidden agenda of others in the room. That is a much needed skill. Additionally, having a shared understanding of the various topics or concepts is beneficial to both of us. It becomes a co-creation experience. This means operating at a more sophisticated level than simply knowing what the signs are for specific words. This deeper level of understanding is crucial. This leads to my third point of synchronization. Synchronization can be harnessed in various ways. For example, the need to manage balanced interactions. Interpreting effectively requires a good balance of interpreting skill and timing. This would see the interpreter managing their lag time well. This is particularly crucial when I am trying to take my turn in conversation or start an intervention. Those are critical times in an interaction. Interpreters need to be acutely aware of the dynamics at play whilst using appropriate intonation while speaking. I appreciate an interpreter informing me of the status of an individual as they speak, as this informs how I choose to interact in the meeting. Another key ability for interpreters is knowing the right time to intervene. There is only a very small window of time when an interpreter can seamlessly input my intervention into the general conversation, drawing the attention of others to me. Well timing those interruptions is invaluable. Turn-taking, including myself, interpreters, and speakers, must operate in an orderly manner, particularly when I'm chairing a meeting. Positioning is another essential element. I need to have direct and clear eye contact with the chair. When other speakers around the table make interventions, I request interpreters to stand behind the speaker. That dynamic movement is more beneficial to me, rather than having the interpreter sit in a fixed location while I cannot see the speaker. I prefer to sit close to the chair of a meeting, so whenever I wish to make a comment, the chair sees me immediately, and that allows me to participate effectively. I have noted that the meetings where I am the chair with hearing people are far easier to manage than meetings when I'm the sole deaf person. Managing the communication is a challenge, and it requires skill. When I chair, I'm aware of the cultural norms and meeting etiquette, so attendees at those meetings follow my lead. However, when meetings are chaired by hearing people, it is challenging. Also worth considering is being sensitive to the context. Primarily, this extends to contextual intelligence, knowing the context of overarching topics or social interactions. Interpreters need to be tuned into the variety of dynamics at play. Secondly, emotional intelligence is important to effectively transfer the tone and emotion of the speaker, to discern their manner and intent. Then I can see if they have a vested interest in the topic or not. I need that sort of information conveyed by the interpreter. Notwithstanding what I've said, interpreters should understand and be sensitive to the status and role of people I am interacting with and respond accordingly, whilst keeping in mind different styles of discourse, their rules, and language norms that adequately reflect the status of the person concerned. For instance, as an expert, if I am meeting with a hearing peer, there would be stylistic differences as compared to my interaction with someone of a superior role who had decision-making powers. If I am operating in my role as an activist in communication with experts or those in political power, there are certain nuances that I'm navigating. Likewise, the dialogue in a citizen meeting with an authority is drastically different when compared to two senior executives communicating in their own respective styles, as would be the case with a politician interacting with other politicians. Interpreters must be perceptive to such communication nuances. So, as we can see, there are multiple factors at play. As a lobbyist, I always have a topic in mind and an outcome I wish to achieve. Interpreters must be aware of the subject matter and concepts to be shared whilst managing the hidden meaning of text and the signals that are transmitted. This is simultaneous to interpreting the event, including the interaction, space, role, and language use. While also being mindful of their power and control, interpreters must coordinate all these moving parts in tandem. This is required to ensure mutual understanding and cooperation. In conclusion, good command of language and strong interpreting skills form the foundation and expectation of what an interpreter brings to their work. It is, however, the highly tuned communication skills that we need to see more of, adapting to any meeting intuitively, situational context maintenance, indicating the nuance of status via language use, and employing appropriate interaction strategies in line with me so I can manage the meeting environment effectively. Space and position management, flexibility and collaboration skills, as well as understanding power mechanisms and power control approaches. All of these skills in an interpreter allow me to lobby effectively at international events. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Sofia Isari, and I am from Greece. Many thanks to the organizers for the invitation to present on behalf of EUD at this conference. I attend along with EUD President Markku Jokinen. I will begin with an introduction of myself. I've been a board member of EUD for the past few years. Here in Greece, I am the head teacher for the deaf kindergarten, where I have worked for the past 17 years. Additionally, I am a deaf interpreter and interpreter trainer, and have been for many years. As an interpreter, I have worked in many different sectors, be it social, sports, at local and national levels here in Greece, but also for international engagements. I have a wealth of experience in the field. Furthermore, I have been involved with EFSLI Deaf Interpreters as chair for 3 years, and I sat on the EFSLI board for 1 year. I have instilled knowledge from these great experiences. I am delighted to present on such an important topic. Before I do, I would like to extend my thanks to Marku for his input on the higher order communication skills interpreters can bring. In turn, I intend to share some insights on how deaf people can meaningfully participate at European level forums and conferences, in addition to how deaf delegates and interpreters can work together in these environments, and various tips to achieve this. Utilizing my considerable experiences alongside various resources, I hope to provide a raft of suggestions to assist with our conference theme. Firstly, as a participant sitting in the audience of an event, it is important not to be distracted and inattentive. Instead, while observing an interpreter, it is critical that you are actively engaging with them. This can happen through eye gaze, facial expressions, or nodding. Doing so will build a rapport with the interpreter, which will positively impact the standards of their work. If I wish to ask a question at the event, ideally I will share my question with someone on the interpreting team to prepare them in advance, which will assist in the precise delivery of my question. Once the meeting has concluded, it is then the appropriate time to follow up and talk to the interpreters in an affable way and say goodbye, instead of quickly dashing out the door the second it is over. Moreover, after the event is the ideal time to provide feedback and or thank interpreters for their work, or use that time to provide constructive feedback with the goal to improve the quality of interpreting services in the future. This is not the time to vilify the interpreter or their work, but rather be reasonable in nature. Doing so will be more encouraging and motivational to the interpreter, and you will be thanked in turn for doing so. It is also good to be aware that at some conference venues, the acoustics or logistics within are not conducive to good quality interpreting due to poor audio or location of the interpreter on site. Deaf delegates should be aware of those environmental circumstances before negatively critiquing an interpreter's work. Those external factors can majorly impact an interpreter, and if we are all aware of these aspects, we can negotiate for the best working conditions to ensure the best quality interpretation. Keep those aspects in mind for future reference for other interpreted events. Many of us are well entrenched in this new COVID normal era where everything is now conducted online. A lot of us have not met face-to-face for more than a year now. It is all very peculiar. For the deaf community and interpreters alike, our entire work life is now digital. How can we provide considered feedback when we all jump online at the same time and are expected to be telepathic? It's exciting in some ways, this new online culture. No doubt it is a challenge, though. With a number of people struggling in this new domain, critically to keep in mind is that while interpreters have gained professional qualifications through interpreter training programs where they learned about deaf culture and aspects about the community, and so on. One second while I get my notes. Meanwhile, the deaf community also needs training. Otherwise, how can there be a symbiotic relationship between deaf people and interpreters? With education will come less misplaced judgment of interpreters' work. Education is the key to understanding, including some of the topics I have covered here today. Deaf delegates need to be aware of such things. At the national and international level, there are varying degrees of quality across different sectors. It is crucial that national associations of the deaf and the national interpreter associations collaborate and work together. For instance, raising awareness in deaf clubs and schools. This way, the deaf community will be educated about the role and expectations of interpreters. This in the future will lead to better understanding between us all. I hope you are all with me on that. I conclude by sincerely thanking you all for your attention on behalf of both Markku Jokinen and I.